Okay,
Well, welcome, Tony. Go ahead.
thank you and welcome everyone. Uh, so as you just saw, we have a lot more complexity nowadays dealing with complexity. And there's this idea that people can multitask. And as I just demonstrated to you, that's impossible. And there's more and more research out there every day that if anyone tells you they can multitask, they are lying. It is not true. So how do we deal with complexity? Holistic management's missing key number one is that we are dealing with a holistic world. We're dealing with complexity. Anytime we deal with ecosystems, finances, or people, we're dealing with complexity. And there's a lot of ways to demonstrate this, but just try like patting yourself on the head and rubbing your stomach at the same time. Just these two things. It's difficult. And then if you add a third one in there, like lift your right leg off the floor and spin your ankle around to the right at the same time you're doing that. Each time we add to the complexity, we get distracted, we get diverted. So the first missing key of holistic management is that we're dealing in a holistic world. And why is that important? Because if we deal with a single variable, and we're bound to be disappointed because complexity self-organizes. So the best that we can do is to influence the self-organization processes to go the direction that we want towards more diversity and complexity. And the only way our feeble brain can do that is to focus on one thing at a time. So how do we do that? With holistic planned grazing. So another thing we learn in managing complexity is that we have to learn to zoom in and zoom out. So this holistic management framework here gives you like the essence of the universe. And it's no matter what we're doing, we're in that context someplace. Now today, we're going to be down here talking about profit and holistic planned grazing. So we look at the context, like what's our ecosystem look like? What is our whole under management? And then zoom in here. So zoom in and zoom out. How can we do that? Well, here's a holistic planned grazing chart. So when you go through this planning process, we go through one step at a time. We have an aid memoir because you don't have to memorize it. And it's not very, wouldn't be very effective to memorize it, but it helps us focus on one thing at a time. We focus on an area. These are all pastures here. So going up and down, we have space. Going from left to right, we have time. We have animals down here. We have all of these different complex factors, but we're focusing on one thing at a time. We zoom in, then we zoom out at the big picture. And how do we do this? With holistic planned grazing. So what is profit? And I think everybody understands that you're grazing for profit. Some people buy stocker cattle, they're putting weight on. Some have cow calf, they're growing, increasing the value of that. Some people are leasing out pasture where you're getting money. But just stop and think about what is profit. Gross income minus direct costs equals our gross profit. And it's really important that we get that whole picture and not skip over it. A lot of times we have a tendency to focus on the product and we forget about controlling the cost to produce that product. So when we do a gross margin analysis, at the very top of our paper, we want to very clearly define what is the purpose of this product. So these animals in this picture are grass finished cattle, but that's the third enterprise in the process. We have a cow calf enterprise whose sole purpose is to produce a 550 pound calf in October. And then we have a stocker enterprise whose sole purpose is to get that 550-pound animal to 950 pounds the next October. And then we have the grass finished enterprise. So in each of those enterprises, we have a tension between what we're trying to get and how much it costs to get there. How do we do that? With holistic plan grazing. And holistic management brings a different perspective to profit. You know, everybody knows it's about money, of course, but in holistic management, it's also our profit is our quality of life. You know, how do we want to be behaving day to day? And so with holistic plan grazing, we want to make sure that this is going to be fun and enjoyable, and we're engaged while we're doing it, or it's not going to get done correctly. So, you know, I prefer to ride a horse. I lived in Wyoming for years. It was a big country, rode a lot of miles. And I always said that I didn't like riding a horse unless I was handling cattle. And I also said I didn't like handling cattle unless I was riding a horse. Now we live in the Pacific Northwest, higher production environment, not as much space. And there's a lot of times I just go out walking with my dog and move animals with the dog. And I enjoy that. But some people prefer to use a four-wheeler. So the point is, think about profit as your quality of life and enjoying what you're doing. So how would you do that? With holistic plan grazing. And we all know that ecological function is part of our profit also. Think of that as the savings account in our bank. We're always drawing on it or we're adding to it. And if you're always drawing on it, at some point it runs out to zero. So this picture is on the ranch that we were on in Wyoming. This is Twin Creek, and it ran through our ranch for 12 miles. And this picture is standing on the bridge where it ran off from our ranch. The person that took this photo then turned around 5 seconds later and took the picture upstream where Twin Creek was on our place. This is after like 16 years of holistic plan grazing. How do you get that result? Through holistic plan grazing. Now, we're talking about profit and grazing. So we have to ask, how do you improve profit? And there's only three ways that we know of to improve profit. We increase the volume, we increase the margin, or we reduce overheads. And there's no other way that we know of to increase profits. So in our example here, in this case, our volume is stocking rate. How many stock units your land is supporting. And that is where we improve a lot of our profit, is by increasing the stocking rate. How do we do that? With holistic plan grazing. Now, when we're talking about improving profit, we go to our financial week link. And here again, we're zooming out so we can zoom in. Now, our product conversion is often where a lot of profit gets left and not utilized in the grazing world. This is where you have over-rested plants standing and oxidizing and not being used. And then we can get to the resource conversion, where we are adding plant vigor, we're adding plant density, we're adding plant diversity, and harvesting more sunlight energy. And then the marketing link would be where we are adding our margin. How do we do that? With holistic plan grazing. So here's a very quick view of what overgrazing is.
Here's overgrazing. You just love that regrowth, little short regrowth. We go back into the pasture here, you can see lots of good tall grass. But they want to eat that little bit regrowth. overgrazing of plants, roots.
So there are 3 ways to overgraze. First, we turn out too early in the spring, graze a plant before it has gotten to the 3.5 leaf stage. Now that said, we also have to remember in holistic management, holism, remember that bison were not in a feedlot through the winter, and you didn't wait for the 3.5 leaf stage. So there's other things that we do to manage that. And we'll talk about that in holistic planned grazing. The second way is to stay in one spot too long. And that's what we're seeing with this horse in this video, staying and grazing regrowth. And the third way is coming back too soon before the plants have recovered. So how do we do this? How do we plan for that with holistic planned grazing? So how do we know for overgrazing? How do we know when that regrowth is at risk? So in this picture here, you see this leaf is square. An animal bit it. Once that leaf is bitten, it doesn't grow a point again. So this is blunt also. So when this plant was grazed, this leaf was at this height. That animal bit that right there. And then since that it was bitten, this is regrown. So you go from 3 inches to 8 inches. So there's 5 inches of regrowth there. Now, when I first started trying to manage overgrazing, I would go watch a cow, wait until she grazed a plant, and then I would go stick a flag on it. And then I would come out every day and measure the regrowth. But this way is not exact because maybe that leaf was down here, so maybe you missed an inch, but it's a way to get a lot of information very quickly. You're riding out to the pasture or walking, and you go through a pasture that's already been grazed and just check a few plants, and you can get a quick idea of what your growth rates are. Let's say this 5 inches of regrowth had been grazed 5 days before. So that would be an inch a day of growth. If it had been 10 days before, that's a ½ inch of growth per day. And I'm sorry for all the UK people, I don't have that in centimeters. So I'm sure you're converting in your head already because us Americans are too lame to learn the metric system here.
Most UK people are bilingual and they can understand inches and metric, but it's the people from all the other countries that don't understand the inches.
Well, I'm not bilingual in this context. But anyway, the point is you can get a lot of information very quickly on what your growth rates are. So if your grazing periods, where your animals are right now, have staying 10 days, you're going to be overgrazing plants. So here we have a plant on the left that was not grazed. And here this plant on the right was grazed. So this is regrowth. Now, if you came back and grazed this plant, you're probably overgrazing because it doesn't look like the ungrazed plant, which has a seed head on it on the left. And it's also, you're also not getting enough plant material to cover the soil surface. So there's a couple quick ways to tell whether you're overgrazing. So on the right here, if you're there for 10 days, you're overgrazing because you're going to regraze this 5 inches of regrowth. On the left, if you brought your cattle back here, you'll be overgrazing because you're coming back too soon. How do you manage that? With holistic planned grazing. So I'm going to turn this video on, and I'm sure you've all watched cows graze, but cow's preferred method of grazing is to wrap her tongue around the grass so she tastes it. Then she lifts her chin and cuts it off with the teeth on the bottom row.
See if they eat that white top. Bunch them around.
So the point is to think about an animal's behavior. She has 3 restrictions. Her most efficient grazing is getting 6 inches of grass. So when they wrap their tongue around it and lift, they leave at 4 to 6 inches. So 6 inches would be 10 to 12 inches. So their most efficient method of grazing is 12-inch high grass, and then leaving that 4 to 6 inches. A cow only grazes 8 hours a day, and they ruminate for 8 hours a day. So you think about these boundaries, and then we can be creative and manage within those boundaries. But if a cow stays longer and comes back to that same plant, they graze with a tromp method. They bite on it and they lift their teeth up and they leave only a half an inch. So what happens then? Well, the plant is going to have to draw on its root reserves to get enough plant material so that it can photosynthesize again. And also that bottom 4 to 6 inches is where worms lay their eggs. So they're picking up eggs and getting worms. And also it's the most highly fibrous part of the plant. You know, the top part of the plant is protein, the middle is energy, and the bottom is just dry matter and fiber. So the best case scenario is to leave that 4 to 6 inch stubble height so the plant keeps photosynthesizing and growing and stays healthy. So how would we manage that with holistic planned grazing? Okay, we looked at that product weak link. That's this overrested plants like this that aren't getting grazed. Now this picture, we have overgrazing out here right beside overrest. And we're talking about the missing key number 2. And the different tools work differently in different environments. We're talking brittleness. And why is that important? Because to build soil, which is what we're trying to do to increase our stocking rate and increase our profit, to build soil, we have to have biological decomposition. And in brittle environments, we don't have the humidity constantly available at the soil surface to decompose that plant material. In fact, the only way we can have humidity constant at the soil surface for 365 days is through the gut of a grazing animal. And then we're building soil. So how would we manage for that? Through holistic planned grazing. So to increase our stocking rate, our volume, the number one factor of improving profit, what do? Summarize what we've talked about here. We want to capture sunlight. How do we do that more efficiently? We improve plant vigor. We improve plant density. We improve plant diversity. So we have longer season. We capture the raindrop, get that raindrop into the soil mantle, and we build soil organic matter. If we're building soil organic matter, you can tell when you walk across the land, you just feel a softness under your feet. If you don't have good soil organic matter and you have compaction, it's like you're walking on a sidewalk or concrete. So you can feel that. So how would we plan for all these factors that are going to increase our stocking rate and increase our volume and increase profitability with holistic planned grazing? Here are some actual numbers on a place we bought that was in Conservation Reserve Program. We took it out and started grazing. And in just 3 years, we increased the average leaf height from 11 to 14 inches. We increased the maximum leaf height from 20 to 30 inches. So the plant vigor is improving by stopping overgrazing. We improved the species mix. In just 3 years, we went from two grass species to 4 grass species. We went from an average of 2.5 forbs to 4 forbs. And Sheila pointed out that I had these keys on these years mixed up, and I was supposed to fix that, and I see I didn't.
It's
So
all
don't
right.
so don't get confused by the color there.
Well, it gives me a chance to ask a question. Is that all right?
Okay.
Bart is asking, what is your thought on the grass plant not being recovered until the first leaves turn brown? And that's something that Grammy Hand says.
I'm not aware of that, but it sounds like it might make sense. Is it starts to senesce? Is that what he's saying?
I guess so. And I hadn't heard that either. But it sounds like you're thinking it's recovered when those first seeds are just starting to come.
Yeah, and I look at it a little differently in high production versus low production in environments too. You know, in high production, the definition of overrest is choking out the growth points of the plant at the base. And in low production environments, like where I was in Wyoming, you know, before we started holistic plan grazing, it was 5 stock days per acre, and we went to 10. But you know, you can go years without choking out the growth points, and the challenge there is to build enough plant material to get on the soil surface and cover the soil surface. So that picture that I showed with that recovered plant, there just wasn't enough plant material there to provide that. But no, I haven't heard of that. So that's interesting. Good information. Okay, then the third thing here is soil organic matter. In just 3 years, we went from 5.5% to 7%. So what does that mean? You know, we know that, here again, I don't have the metric, but we know that 1% of soil organic matter holds from 18 to 28,000 gallons per acre. So if we take the low end of that, let's take the 18,000 gallons per acre, that's equivalent to 0.6 of an inch of rain. So 7% soil organic matter will hold a 4.2 inch rain. If you have a 4-inch rain in just 30 minutes, there's not going to be any runoff. So how would we manage that with holistic plan grazing? So then we address the volume. Now, the other way to increase profit is to increase the margin. When we talk about increasing margin, most people immediately jump to the income side of the ledger, how they're going to add value. In our case, that's grass finished beef. We get a 15% margin over commodity beef with our grass finished beef. But we also need to think about the cost side of the ledger. Remember, we talked about that tension between the two. So for this example, we're talking the gain, our labor, our vet expense, our death, and supplement in our gross margin. So how are we able to manage all of these different things with holistic plan grazing? So think about labor. So on this, the right-hand picture here is where I lived in Wyoming for 31 years. And when we first started there, we ran 600 cows and about 500 yearlings. And we had 4 full-time employees. After holistic management, we ran, after a few years, we ran 1,200 head of pairs and 1,000 yearlings and only 2 employees. So how's that happen? It's really very simple. When you concentrate animals, you concentrate labor and makes it more efficient. It's more intense. You need to be there at a certain time and place, and you don't ever want to lose the trust of the animals that you're harboring, and that means being there on time. Now this picture on the left is our place in Oregon. And there's only like 30 head here and move on just like a quarter of an acre. And it takes about 30 minutes twice a day. But there again, you concentrate animals, you concentrate labor. Then I can do other things like work with Sheila on a grazing planning seminar and working with the Jefferson Center on things they're doing. So how do you plan on cutting labor? It's holistic plan grazing. And one thing I might add here, I was going to talk about it later, but just throw it out there now too. The most efficient and best way to cut labor costs is training. Don't cut your expenses on keeping your staff and yourself up to speed on low stress livestock handling, nutrition, and these types of things.
Oh, may I interrupt with a couple of questions before you move on?
Okay.
How was the species of grasses doubled? Was it by new seeds, by reseeding, or was it natural?
It was natural. In that particular example, we had conservation reserve program land that hadn't been grazed for 15 years. And after the first grazing, we just had a flush of hairy vetch. So we got a forb and I don't know where they come from. In Wyoming, it was a little different. When we got off the throat of things there, you started seeing like blue bunch wheatgrass and then green needle and Indian rice grass appear. And what we noticed is they were not new seedlings. They were plants that had just been hunkering down, maybe photosynthesizing just a little bit, staying down there like about a half inch underneath the grazing teeth. And after we started managing overgrazing and minimizing overgrazing, they were finally able to grow and increase the production and diversity of species. So there are situations where you could seed. I don't have experience in that. My experience is just mimicking nature, stop overgrazing, and these species just appear.
Okay, one more question. Would you please repeat the conversion of 1% carbon to the rainfall that would hold?
Oh, so 1 acre of 1% increase in soil organic matter holds at least 16,000 gallons per acre. If you go through the math, that's equivalent to about 0.6 of an inch of rain. So how many millimeters is that?
Maybe 18.
Okay. And then you can get up to like 28,000 gallons per acre, and that would be a bunch more. But, most places that have been overgrazed and have a pretty simple bacterial soil as a result of that, or something that's over irrigated even, or used herbicides and fertilizers on, maybe only has like 1% soil organic matter and probably not over 3. And with a little grazing planning, you can improve that pretty quickly. If you get up to 5%, now you're talking a 3-inch rain. And most places I've been, you don't usually get more than a 3-inch rain at one time. But you get all that into the soil mantle and hold it, recharge the groundwater, feed your springs, grow grass and all these things rather than running off. When the raindrop hits the ground, there's several things it can do. It can evaporate, it can run to the river, or it can go into the soil mantle. And that's what we want. Okay, another way to increase margin is cut our vet expenses and death loss. Now here we're talking missing key number 3, where grasslands evolved with high disturbance and long recovery periods. And those of us who've been around holistic management know that these large herds became large herds to protect themselves from predators. And as a result, they would eat everything. So then they'd have to move to get something to eat. The accounts of the bison in the northern Great Plains, the majority of the herd would go through an area in 3 to 5 days, and all the laggards and everything behind would be through in about 10 days. I think it's really interesting that the heel and horn fly also have a 10-day life cycle. So if that horn fly lays an egg in the manure, then that larvae feeds on that manure and hatches, but it doesn't hatch until all the animals are gone. So the bison probably didn't have any flies. And in managing our cattle, we can mimic nature that way. And if we're moving a significant distance, I think the research is like half a mile from the last water, you're probably not going to have much for flies. And the death loss is it's just because you're on clean ground all the time. You're not standing in their own defecation and where things rot and they get hoof rot and all these other things, but they're on clean ground. Our death loss went from like 1.5% to less than 0.5% in 5 years of once we started holistic planned grazing. So death loss is a big one. So how would we manage that with holistic planned grazing? We also can increase our margin by cutting herbicide costs. Now, why would we go out and kill something good enough to eat? This is a place that we own out here in the Ponderosa grassland, and this is Scotch thistle. And this had been kind of a feedlot area from the previous owner. And so we planned to be in there when the thistles went to bloom to graze those thistles. So we did that with our grazing chart, planned our grazing so that we would get there when we needed to be there. So this is in August of that year. And here we are, this cow grazing that thistle. So in this first year, we grazed these plants 3 times. They grazed the head, and then you move the cattle out, and every place that one of the blooms was grazed, it sent out like 3 or 4 more. So then we came back in 30 days and grazed it again. And the same thing happened, and we grazed it again. So we grazed those thistle plants, intentionally overgrazing them for that summer 3 times. Okay, let me back up here. Okay, notice these 3 trees. That's kind of the focal point here of where those thistles are. So those 3 trees would be off to our left here. They're not in this picture. But here's those 3 trees right here in 2013. And here they are in 2015. So after 4 years, those thistles are pretty much gone. And no herbicide cost. The animals got nutrition from them. And one thing I've noticed is after you start improving your soil health, the bricks goes up in the weeds and the thistle, and animals will graze them a little easier. How do you do that? Through holistic planned grazing. So the biggie increasing our margin is using supplements and not replacement. So we want to be grazing grass as long as we can through the year. and not replacing it with hay. So as we go through holistic plant grazing and improve the soil health, that nutrition will improve also. And in snow, if we can strip graze in snow, if animals don't walk through that snow, it doesn't get hard. So you can graze through snowy weather also. Here's a
Here they
slide
are.
here.
Coming down their new swath. I'd leave a little bit.
So looking at that swath, you know, it's about 7 steps wide. It's about 300 steps long. So it's about 2,100 square yards, which is a little less than half an acre. So you can keep a handle on what your yield is as you're moving along. So how would you do that with holistic plant grazing? So as we're managing for profit in our grazing, you need to think about our marginal reaction. In all of the testing questions, we need to think about ways to quantify those. Like, for example, animal impact. We say we want to use animal impact, but how do you quantify that? Like on our range in Wyoming, where we had 10 stock days per acre, I noticed that for good things to happen, we needed to have a hoof print at least every square foot. And so then you start working backwards, you know, what is the stock density that we need to get a hoof print in every square foot? Well, it turned out we needed at least 3 stock units per acre to achieve that. And with 10 stock days per acre, we were looking at 3-day moves to get that accomplished. But the point is, you know, everybody's context is a little different, but just think about how you quantify the tool that you're using and what you want to do. So in marginal reaction, one way we can quantify to see what we need to manage is a variable sensitivity analysis. So here we take our variable, our stocking rate, and we have a probable, and we have a worst case and a best case scenario. And then we hold all of the other variables in the probable scenario and take one variable from the worst to the best and see how that affects your bottom line. So this is an actual on our Buffalo Peak property that we bought just 2 years ago. On day 1, it was 130 stock days per acre. And this year we're harvesting 182 stock days per acre. So that's the probable. So what is the downside risk? You know, if you get a drought or something, you know, we've all in our own context seen how much loss we'll have. In this case, we're on the uptrend. So I'm saying in my context, the downside risk is 150 stock days per acre. But I know we've been here for 10 years and we have our other place with the same soil type, same situation. We dealt with compaction here and we've gone to 260 stock days per acre. So that's our upside potential. So the reason we do this, a variable sensitivity analysis as a way to quantify marginal reaction, is to tell us which variable is the most important, which one is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. So we focus our investment of time and money in managing that variable. So then we have labor, like we said, you know, ours probable case is about 10 cents per stock day. And if you're not getting things done, and like say I had a broken leg or something and I had to get a high school kid that hadn't been trained, maybe that goes up to 20 cents a day. If you're really on top of it, maybe it goes down to 5 cents. But the point is identify your risk, the downside risk, and the potential on the upside, so we know which variables are important. Now, the price per stock day doesn't really apply in my scenario, but I put it in here because it does to a lot of people. And I want to explain some context. Like in Wyoming, we had a custom grazing business. And as I said, we had 1,200 cow-calf pairs and 1,000 yearlings. And we had from 10 to 15 different brands. And I had these basic rules. I had told people that they had to give me a 24-hour notice before they could bring their cattle. I had to have a 48-hour notice before they could pick them up when they wanted to get them. They had to have their bulls tested for trichomoniasis. They had to do these certain things. Their cows had to be managed for trick. And so when I first started that business, we took cattle in for 10% less than the average as posted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for our state. And after 15 years of that business, we were getting a 30% premium over and above that number. And we had a waiting list of 1,500 head of animals that wanted to come to our place. And the reason, the context of the situation is that there was a farming area there. And a lot of the farmers had 50 to 100 head of cows, and they didn't want to deal with them in the summertime. So we pastured those cattle for them. So it was the context of that social situation that combined in providing them with a good service, and that allowed us for that premium. So I just included that in there for a scenario as one of the variables. And then death loss, they said, we went from 1.5% to 0.5% in Wyoming. Here, I've only lost 3 animals here in 11 years that we've been here. Pretty low. It's like the probable we're saying here is 0.006. That's kind of what we've lost. So how does that affect things? And then we talked about the supplement. So the 88 cents per stock day is feeding hay for about 60 days. If we could get to where we're never feeding hay and manage our grazing and have healthy soil, so we have more nutrition in that grass, we would have 70 cents per stock day. And if we're having to feed hay for 120 or 150 days, it's going to be about $1.06 per stock day. So this isn't a variable, gives you an idea of what that's going to happen. And these numbers, I don't want to get down in them. I wanted to throw out this theory. The intention is to quantify your marginal reaction. And the variable sensitivity analysis is one way to do that, but it's in your context. You have to understand what your probable case is, and you have to assign that risk and the potential gain. This example was based on 400 acres with the stocking rate of 130 to 260 stock days per acre. It's based on 200 stock units, 365 days, and 70 cents per day on the grass value. So how would you manage all this with holistic planned grazing?
Thank you, Tony. We've got a question. I think it's on a previous slide. And Joao wants to understand better the idea of supplement versus replace. What were you explaining with that concept?
Yeah, so supplement, like say you're grazing grass and you have 6% protein. And if you assume they're grazing 3%, that would be 30 pounds. That'd be 1.8 pounds of protein. And an animal in her 3rd trimester, and after she has her calf, that's not enough. So we would supplement that grass with some kind of a protein supplement. In our part of the world, the cheapest way to supplement protein is alfalfa. So maybe you can feed them like 5 pounds of alfalfa a day to supplement the grass. But if you have grass and you do like the average of all the ranchers in the United States feed hay for 120 days a year, whether they need it or not. So they're replacing grass with pretty much there's a little better nutrition, maybe a little more vitamin A, where you, if you supplement, you can reduce the cost. If you replace, your costs go up. Does that explain that?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. And that was very precise. I mean, you know these rations like the back of your hand. It's very impressive. How do you learn all that?
Well, just get some, test your hay, and then all the universities have a whole bunch of information on animals' needs, their protein needs, their vitamin A, calcium, phosphorus, these types of things. And so if you know what your grass is, and you'll know what you're missing. But the great news is, after a few years of holistic plant grazing, and you improve the soil health, those numbers will improve. And it's also being documented now that as the animal becomes healthier from that healthier soil, that humans that eat that beef are getting more nutritious food too. So the supplementation maybe has been necessary because we kind of got departed from mimicking nature and doing things, and the soil is depleted and all that. So we can get it back.
Thank you.
Okay, so in quantifying our marginal reaction, we had on the previous page, so we just put that on a graph so it's simple to look at. You can see there's a lot of downside risk if supplement or replacing, but there's a lot of upside potential. So that is a variable that we could pay attention to and go to the university and get some information and do some forage testing, send our forage, whatever we're feeding, into the lab and get some results on that so that we can better manage that variable. And then the death variable isn't that much, and the vet isn't that much. Now, the example I did about the per stock day on custom grazing, if you're custom grazing, there's some pretty good upside if you can start getting a premium over the average. And that will depend on the context of everybody's situation. You know, in my situation in Wyoming, I had this farmer clientele that needed to get rid of the animals, and we did a good job of managing losses and providing the service of taking the animals and getting them back to them when they're ready. So that would be in everybody's different context. Then labor, and we've got some downside here. That was from my example of me breaking a leg and not having anybody trained to take care of it. So once again, the big thing there is think about training, learning low stress livestock handling, learning how to set up your fences and how much hay to give them a day or how much grass to give them a day and these types of things. It's all of holistic management is about managing relationships, and our labor, we can have more attention to training so that they are better with relationships with animals, with relationships with the grass, and relationships with money. And then the stocking rate. You know, the stocking rate is huge. And in my experience, you know, I've managed land in the northern Great Plains of the United States, the Rocky Mountain sagebrush steppe, the Pacific Northwest, ponderosa grasslands, even Hawaii. I've managed a ranch in Maui. And in I've consulted on different ranches, and without variation, the stocking rate is a very highly important variable, and we can improve that. We have a lot of upside. So then let's just, like I said, with this variable sensitivity analysis, it'll usually show that there are only 2 or 3 variables to manage. So what did that look like? Yeah, so 76% of the downside is in only 3 variables. And 92% of the upside potential is only 3 variables. So a variable sensitivity analysis is a good way to help us focus on our marginal reaction, where we're going to get the biggest bang for a buck. And a really important way to do that is with holistic plant grazing. So we talked about this not overgrazing, and a lot of people still don't understand what overgrazing is. I'm sure my neighbors, when they went past this field, they said, boy, Tony is really overgrazing. But this was a field that was all recovered, had good grass in it. And we shipped cattle out of here. I had cattle in here. It was rainy and wet. And so I had cattle in here for like a week as we shipped. But the plant, the root structure was all sound because those plants were all recovered. So that, remember these 3 trees right here and this lone tree here? So here's next June. There's that lone tree. So this is that same spot in June. And that comes as a result of having good plant vigor and not overgrazing. High utilization is not overgrazing. High utilization has other issues that we manage from time to time. Now this goes to the missing key number 4, that overgrazing is a function of time and not numbers. So that time is grazing too soon, staying too long, or returning before plant recovery has continued. And the example, we have this healthy plant here that got grazed, and it draws on the root reserves to grow some plant material so it can start photosynthesizing again. And the general rule of thumb, you need about 6 inches of a plant to photosynthesize. And when you get to that 6 inches, it reverses and the roots start to expand again. So if we graze that plant one time where that cow wraps her tongue around there, they leave 4 to 6 inches. So you might only go to here and there. And there's times that we want to graze it short. There's times if we're trying to encourage clover, we want to graze the grass very short, and that will give the clover a competitive edge. But just understanding the context, your context, what you're trying to do, and holistic plant grazing gives us a lot of avenues to increase profit, increase our ecological health, and increase our social relations with our customers and neighbors.
Tony, we've got a question from Barbara. In the UK, we have a lot of problems with TB, and so the government has a lot of restrictions around moving animals. Do you have any similar problem with TB or any other disease that prevents you from moving animals without a lot of testing and evidence and things like that?
Yeah, brucellosis is the biggest one. If your animals have brucellosis, you pretty much get locked down and quarantined until you get things cleaned up. Most everything else that I can think of, you have to have health papers if you cross a state line. And if there's some issue arises, they can track those animals back to the origin. But yeah, the question that we need to ask more often is, what is the root cause of that? You know, why do you get TB? Is it, you know, like I was talking earlier, we get worms, and cows get worms if they graze down below 4 inches. That's where the eggs of the worms live. You know, if we're staying longer than 10 days in one spot, we have fly issues and bad eyes and things like that. So, no, I've never been around TB. I don't know that.
Thank you.
No more questions?
Oh yeah, we got another one. Vivian is asking, do you know a study about this picture? I often get asked about it. Is there like some study behind this drawing that you're aware of?
Well, the label there at the bottom says it's from New Zealand Sheep Council.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a place to start.
Okay.
And there's a soil scientist, Nicole Masters, has a book, For the Love of Soil, out, and she has a recurring comment about people that make these huge investments in ranch land and farms, and they never even dig a hole. That really struck me, because I've bought a lot of ranches in my lifetime, and I never dug a hole. So Nicole Masters, it's a great book, and it's a little over my head, but it gives you a lot to think about. And she talks about the microorganisms in the soil as her livestock and managing that livestock to decompose soil and build soil.
Thank you for that, Tony. I'm just going to say, because we're at the end of the time that, you know, we advertised the webinar, but we're going to carry on because I know that a lot of people are really interested. And we've got a couple more questions here. So let's get to them before we go too much further along. Sam says, going to that picture with the dead tree, did the plants recover like that because the grass was dormant in the winter? Would you expect the plants to be seriously damaged if it was grazed like that in a growing period in the summer?
That's a good point. If it was grazed like that in a growing period in the summer and then repeatedly, yes, it would be damaged. But if it was grazed like that in the growing period in the summer only once, and then not grazed until recovery, probably well into the next season, I don't think there would be damage. In that particular picture that hadn't been grazed all year, and it was grazed very heavily, but just that one short event before winter, so everything was shut down, and it probably had good solid root reserves, and you know, there could have been a case in wet ground like that with high animal impact that maybe the crowns of the plants were hurt. And I've darn sure had that happen in cases where I have a high clay soil. You know, more sandy or loamy soil, I haven't had that issue where high animal impact damages the crown, but in clay soil, it sure will, in my experience.
Okay, so then Gideon says, do you have any routine medical treatment regime, or are you only treating when required?
Yeah, we vaccinate our calves for the respiratory and diseases twice, give them their booster shot. We give them a shot at branding, then a booster shot. We vaccinate our heifers for brucellosis, and that's all that we do. I have very rarely had to do much else.
we've got more questions. Daniel says, building on Sam's question, how does the idea of overgrazing being a function of time change if you are grazing after the growing season has ended?
Well, help me out here, Sheila, but I think Alan Savory is pretty crystal clear in that when plants are dormant, there's no risk of overgrazing. You know, at that point in my mind, it's just a matter of residual. You know, if you have some residual, you're definitely going to see earlier growth in the spring, you know, a couple of weeks for sure. And especially if you have good plant vigor with a little residual, you'll extend your season by 2 to 3 weeks in the spring.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. And we have kind of an oddity here in the UK and Ireland where it's very temperate. And so technically the growing season stops in the winter, but you can get some warm days where it's above 5°C, and you can have grass growing in the so-called non-growing season. So we have to be careful in the winter, in other words.
Yeah, we have that here where I am in the Pacific Northwest, but I didn't ever have to worry about that in Wyoming.
Yeah. And then we've got someone else asking a question. Have you ever met anyone who didn't make a profit from holistic planned grazing?
You know, people that implement holistic planned grazing, I've never seen a situation where their stocking rate did not increase by at least 50%. And I've seen up to 400%. My personal case, the best I've ever done is 260% increase. And that was over a 15-year time period on BLM ground, where many Western ranchers will tell you that you can't ever get an increase. I definitely say holistic planned grazing will increase your stocking rate, which is huge. Remember, we had these 3 ways that we can improve profit: increasing volume, increasing margin, and reduce overheads. So by definition, anytime you increase the stocking rate, anytime you increase the volume, you automatically reduce your overheads. So you're getting a double bang for your buck there. Because if you increase your stocking rate by 100%, double your numbers, which I've seen many, many, many times. People improve their stocking rate by that much. You basically just got a free ranch. Think about the land that you're managing right now. And what would you say if I said, I can give you a free ranch, a free farm, just like the one that you have? And you double your stocking rate, you just got a free ranch or a free farm. And your overheads are the same. You didn't have to increase overheads any to double that. So you cut your overheads in half, increase your stocking rate, double your gross income. So that's pretty good positive
Good math. Very good math. Okay, let's carry on. You know, we have another question came up. Okay, this is a really common question for this part of the world, from Andrew. And he says, we have low pH in our fields with quite a lot of mosses. The soil analysis recommended liming to alter the pH. Presumably the alternative to liming would be holistic planned grazing. Is that right?
You know, I don't have any experience with liming. I've heard that a lot. I read about it in Nicole Masters' book, and she talks about having bacterial soils on one end of the spectrum that are a result of overgrazing, over irrigation, herbicides, and fertilizer. And those soils are expressed, bacterial soils expressed with cheatgrass, thistle, and medusa head. Then at the other end of the spectrum are fungal soils, which you usually see in timber country. And the ideal is to get in the middle there where you have more plant diversity. So no, I don't have any experience with liming, but I bet you Nicole Masters would have an answer for that. And
Yeah, I think it relates to our high rainfall here, shifting the pH, as well as the most common way of grazing here is set stock grazing. So the soils just don't have deep roots. And the Soil Farmer of the Year here in the UK just did a webinar, and he was trained by us in holistic management in 2019. And he talked in his webinar how he didn't need to do the lime, and the pH actually got better. But he when he first met us, we had a big conversation with him about lime.
did he have any thoughts on cause and effect?
No, it's just really creating the better soil health. That's the key issue. And when Alex first asked us about it, I did ask Alan about it, and Alan said the pH, that's just a symptom. It's not the underlying root cause of the problem, and you really have to get at the underlying root cause of the problem. So treating it with lime is just treating a symptom. It's not going to change anything permanently, and it's something that you probably have to repeat, which is what we want to get out of in holistic management, is the dependency on things that aren't addressing the underlying root cause of the problem.
Right. So if we go back to our summary of the increasing volume right there, right here on the right. You know, if we're holistic plant grazing, we're going to improve the plant vigor. We're going to improve plant density. We're going to improve plant diversity. We're going to capture the rain drop, or maybe in your case, it's having a better water cycle and water moving away, getting away from there.
Well, no, is drawing the water in, because when we do water infiltration tests here, the most common scenario is we can't wait long enough to finish the test because the water cycle is typically broken, completely ineffective.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, I think all of these results we get from holistic plant grazing are going to improve soil health. And like you say, that addresses the pH.
Yep. Yeah, I think a lot of people are commenting similar in the chat. So
Okay.
one person is saying Gabe Brown and Nicole Masters would both say focus on the soil biology, balancing out and not putting more things on it. Use local native species of grass, etc. And yeah, I think that's the remedy. Focusing on the soil biology, healthy soil.
That was all the slides I had, but we can take questions for however
Okay,
long.
no, I didn't know that you had gotten to the end. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just see if there are any more questions here. And if not, then we're finished for today. Chat has gone quiet.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Tony. It was
Thank
really a
you.
pleasure to learn from you. We so much appreciate you sharing your long experience with us and your wisdom.
Well, I appreciate working with you. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye.